Millionaire sees street girl save food for grandma. His heart shatters into pieces. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Ethan Walker's expensive watch showed precisely 7:15 a.m. when he took his usual seat at the corner table of Pete's Newsstand Cafe. Saturday. Morning in downtown Los Angeles carried the same methodical rhythm as any weekday for the 32-year-old CEO. Your usual, Mr. Walker? The barista already had his black coffee prepared. Thank you, Sarah. He barely looked up from his tablet, where quarterly reports awaited review. At Walker Enterprises, weekends meant uninterrupted work time. Ethan's disciplined schedule had built his tech company into a $2 billion valuation in just 8 years. Forbes had recently featured him as the Calculator, a nickname he secretly appreciated for its accuracy. Every decision was numbers-driven, every relationship a transaction. The morning sun reflected off the glass buildings surrounding the small outdoor cafe. Ethan absently adjusted his tailored jacket, scrolling through projections for the Asian market expansion. If I eat just a little bit, maybe there'll be some left for my grandma. The whispered words, so soft they shouldn't have penetrated his bubble of concentration, somehow reached him. Ethan's finger paused mid-scroll. Across the patio, a small girl with unruly brown hair sat alone on the edge of a planter. She wore a faded yellow dress and clutched a small plate of scrambled eggs, examining it as though it contained precious gems. Something about her intense focus made Ethan look twice. She couldn't be more than 6, yet she sat unaccompanied, carefully, rationing her modest breakfast. He returned to his screen, but the numbers blurred. The child's whisper had derailed his concentration, an unprecedented occurrence. When he glanced up again, she was delicately eating one small forkful at a time, placing her fork down between bites with unusual restraint for a child. Without conscious decision, Ethan found himself standing, walking toward her. Hello there. The girl looked up, startled. Large brown eyes met his with immediate wariness. Are you all by yourself? He asked, immediately regretting the abruptness of his question. She nodded cautiously. My grandma's sick today. I came to get breakfast. She patted a small coin purse beside her. The nice lady gave me extra eggs. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Children weren't part of his expertise. Is your grandma nearby? 3 blocks that way. She pointed vaguely eastward. But I know the way, I'm very responsible. The pride in her voice contrasted sharply with the gravity of a 6-year-old navigating the city alone. I'm Emily, she offered unexpectedly. I'm Ethan. He found himself sitting on the planter beside her. Those eggs look good, but they might not be enough for both you and your grandma. Emily's face fell. I know. But it's better than nothing. Something unfamiliar twisted in Ethan's chest, an emotion he couldn't immediately categorize. How about this? He heard himself saying. What if we get some more food to take to your grandma? Would that be okay? Emily studied him with surprising intensity for a child. My grandma says not to accept things from strangers. Your grandma is very wise. Ethan nodded seriously. But I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm Ethan, remember? And you're Emily. A small smile formed on her lips. That's true, and Grandma is really hungry. As Emily carefully wrapped her remaining eggs in a napkin, Ethan realized his schedule for the day had just changed completely. The morning sun warmed Emily's small face as she led Ethan east from the cafe. Despite her size, she walked with purpose, occasionally glancing back to ensure he followed. This way, Mr. Ethan, she instructed, pointing to a narrow street lined with small shops just waking up for the day. Ethan checked his phone. 14 missed notifications already. Margaret, his executive assistant, had texted 3 times about the investor meeting on Monday. He silenced the device and slipped it into his pocket. My grandma sells flowers over there sometimes, Emily said, pointing to a small plaza where a few vendors were setting up stalls. But not when she's sick. She makes the prettiest bouquets in Los Angeles. I'm sure she does, Ethan replied, surprised by his own gentleness. He typically dispensed with small talk, valuing efficiency above social niceties. "What's your favorite food, Emily?" he asked as they waited at a crosswalk. She considered this question with endearing seriousness. "Ice cream," she finally declared, "but not just any ice cream. Vanilla with rainbow sprinkles." "Not chocolate?" "Most kids like chocolate. Vanilla is elegant," she stated with authority, leaving Ethan to wonder which cooking show had taught her that word. They stopped at a small grocery, where Ethan purchased bread, soup, fruit, and pre-made sandwiches. Emily insisted on carrying the lightest bag, her small face determined as she balanced it carefully. "Maybe we should get her medicine too," Emily suggested. "Her cough sounds like this." She demonstrated a concerning wheeze that made Ethan frown. "How long has she been sick?" "A long time, but she says it's just a cold." They added cold medicine to their purchases. As they neared a small ice cream cart, Emily's pace slowed, her eyes lingering on the colorful display. "Would you like some ice cream?" Ethan asked. Emily's eyes widened. "Now, before lunch? Special circumstances call for special measures," he said, surprising himself with this departure from order and routine. Minutes later, they sat on a bench, Emily savoring her vanilla cone with rainbow sprinkles, while Ethan watched, his untouched coffee ice cream melting slightly in the warmth. "You should eat yours before it melts," she advised seriously. "That's what Grandma always says, don't waste good things." Ethan took a bite, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten ice cream. Probably in college before the startup consumed his life. "It's good," he admitted, finding unexpected pleasure in the simple treat. Emily nodded knowingly. Ice cream makes everything better, even sad days. As they resumed walking, Emily's small hand found his, a gesture so natural, he didn't think to question it. They turned into a neighborhood of modest apartment buildings, some with small container gardens on balconies and children's toys visible through windows. "We're almost there," Emily announced as they approached a blue building with a small but well-tended patch of flowers by the entrance. "Grandma lives on the 3rd floor." Climbing the stairs, Ethan felt an unexpected nervousness. What was he doing here, following a child he'd just met to deliver groceries? This spontaneity was entirely out of character. Emily knocked on a worn, painted light blue. "Grandma, I brought breakfast and I made a new friend." The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes that suddenly widened in shock. "Ethan?" she whispered. "Margaret." He replied, equally stunned, the grocery bags nearly slipping from his grasp. Time seemed to freeze in the narrow hallway. Ethan felt as though he'd been suddenly transported back 22 years, to the echoing corridors of St. Catherine's Children's Home. The face before him was older, lined with years and worry, but the kind eyes remained unmistakable, eyes that had once watched over him when nobody else would. "You two know each other?" Emily asked, her small voice breaking the spell. Margaret grasped the doorframe for support. "Yes, sweetheart," she managed, her gaze never leaving Ethan's face. I knew Ethan when he was a little boy, not much older than you." "From the orphanage," Ethan said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The word felt foreign on his tongue. He'd spent years ensuring it never appeared in his carefully crafted biography. Emily's eyes widened. "Grandma worked at an orphanage? With kids who didn't have mommies and daddies?" Margaret nodded slowly, then stepped back. "Please come in. Don't stand in the hallway." The apartment was small but impeccably kept. Cheerful curtains framed the windows, and Emily's artwork decorated the walls. The furniture was obviously second-hand but had been lovingly maintained. It felt more like a home than Ethan's sterile penthouse ever had. "I brought some food," Ethan said lamely, lifting the bags. "Emily was hungry and she mentioned you weren't feeling well." "Emily," Margaret's voice sharpened slightly, "did you go all the way to the cafe by yourself again, after I specifically asked you not to?" The little girl studied her shoes. "You were coughing a lot in your sleep, and there wasn't any bread left." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, torn between concern and understanding. "We'll discuss this later." She turned to Ethan, uncertainty clouding her features. I don't know what to say. After all these years. You disappeared, Ethan said, the words escaping before he could filter them. One day you were there, and the next, nothing. Not even goodbye. Margaret flinched. I wanted to explain. Can I have a sandwich, Grandma? Emily interrupted, unaware of the tension. Mr. Ethan bought turkey and cheese, my favorite. The moment broke. Margaret smiled weakly at her granddaughter. Of course, sweetheart. Let's put these groceries away first. As Margaret moved toward the small kitchen, Ethan noticed her occasional cough and the careful way she moved as if conserving energy. She was ill. More than just a cold, he suspected. Emily chatted happily as she helped unpack, oblivious to the charged silence between the adults. Ethan's mind raced through memories. Margaret's bedtime stories in the orphanage, her special pancakes on Sundays, the way she'd remembered every child's birthday when no one else did. I can explain, Margaret said quietly when Emily went to wash her hands, though I don't expect you to understand. They told me you'd resigned, Ethan replied, keeping his voice level. That you'd found a better opportunity. A bitter smile crossed Margaret's face. Is that what they said? I was fired, Ethan. Budget cuts. They gave me 24 hours to leave the staff housing. But you didn't say goodbye. To any of us. Margaret's eyes glistened. They wouldn't let me. Said it would disrupt the children's routine. As if vanishing would somehow be better. Before Ethan could respond, Emily returned, proudly carrying plates to the small table. Mr. Ethan is staying for lunch, right? She asked, setting a third place without waiting for an answer. Ethan glanced at Margaret, who gave a slight nod. I'd be honored, he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. The sandwich tasted better than anything Ethan had eaten at the 5-star restaurants he frequented. Perhaps it was the company. Emily dominated the conversation, flitting between topics with childish abandon. Her school, her friends, the stray cat that visited their window sometimes. Margaret spoke little, occasionally dabbing at her nose with a tissue. Her cough was concerning, a deep rattle that suggested something more serious than a cold. Why are you working today, Mr. Ethan? Emily asked suddenly. Grandma says Saturday is for fun, not work. Some people don't know how to have fun, Margaret said softly, her eyes meeting Ethan's with a knowing look. I've always enjoyed working, Ethan replied defensively. Even when you were little? Emily pressed. Ethan paused, caught off guard. Had he enjoyed anything as a child? Before the tech company, before business school, even before the foster family that eventually took him in, what had brought him joy? He used to draw, Margaret said unexpectedly. Buildings, machines, quite impressive for a 9-year-old. Ethan stared at her, stunned that she remembered. When lunch ended, Emily insisted on showing Ethan her collection of rocks and seashells. As she led him to her tiny bedroom, Margaret cleared the dishes, waving away his offer to help. Emily's room was a child's sanctuary, walls covered with her artwork, a small shelf of worn but cherished books, and a bedspread featuring cartoon dolphins. Her collection sat proudly on the windowsill, each item labeled in wobbly handwriting. This one's from the beach, she explained, holding up a smooth stone. And this shell sounds like the ocean. She held it to his ear, watching expectantly until he nodded in confirmation. Returning to the living room, they found Margaret sitting wearily on the sofa, a hand pressed to her chest. Grandma? Emily's voice held immediate concern. Just tired. Sweetheart, Margaret assured her. Why don't you read for a bit while I talk with Mr. Ethan? Once Emily was settled with a book, Margaret turned to Ethan. I appreciate the food, but you didn't need to do that. It wasn't charity, he said quickly. Small smile crossed her lips. You always were proud, Margaret. He hesitated. Your cough sounds serious. Have you seen a doctor? She looked away. Healthcare is expensive when you're between jobs. Between jobs? The restaurant where I was head chef closed 3 months. Ego. Corporate buyout. Her hands, which Ethan remembered as always busy, cooking, mending, comforting, twisted in her lap. I've been selling flowers, taking odd catering jobs. It's temporary. Ethan reached for his wallet. Let me help for old time's sake. Margaret's expression hardened. I don't want your money, Ethan. It's just help, he insisted, pulling out his checkbook. You need medical attention. What I need is my dignity, she replied firmly. I'm not looking for handouts, even from someone I once considered family. The word family hit Ethan like a physical blow. Family was a concept he'd abandoned long ago, replacing it with achievements, acquisitions, stock, options. Then what can I do? He asked, genuinely at a loss. Margaret studied him, her gaze penetrating as it had been when he was a boy trying to hide a broken rule. Why are you really here, Ethan? You've become exactly what you always wanted. Successful, wealthy, independent. What could an old woman and a child possibly offer you? Ethan had no answer. His carefully constructed world of metrics and outcomes had no formula for this situation. For the first time in years, he faced a question to which spreadsheets and algorithms provided no solution. Emily looked up from her book. Are you coming back tomorrow, Mr. Ethan? His eyes met Margaret's across the room. Behind her stern exterior, he glimpsed vulnerability and perhaps hope. If that would be all right, he said cautiously. Margaret's nod was nearly imperceptible, but it was enough. The Walker Enterprises Tower dominated the Los Angeles skyline, a gleaming monument to success and innovation. But as Ethan drove away from Margaret and Emily's apartment, the building seemed to mock him from a distance. 27 floors of glass and steel that had consumed his life for the past decade, yet suddenly felt hollow. His penthouse was exactly as he'd left it that morning, immaculate, designer-furnished, and utterly lifeless. No drawings on the refrigerator, no well-worn furniture bearing the imprints of those who loved it. No small voice asking impossible questions. Ethan loosened his tie and poured himself a scotch he didn't really want. His phone had accumulated 43 notifications during his absence from the digital world. None seemed important now. Instead of addressing them, he found himself kneeling before a storage closet, pulling out boxes he hadn't opened since moving in 3 years ago. In the third box, beneath college textbooks and business awards, he found what he was looking for. A small, battered tin box. Inside were the few mementos he'd kept from his childhood. A marble, a ticket stub from his first baseball game with his foster family, and at the bottom, folded carefully, a photograph. It showed a Christmas celebration at St. Catherine's. Younger versions of children whose names he'd mostly forgotten stood around a modestly decorated tree. In the background, partially cropped, stood Margaret. She wasn't looking at the camera but at the children, her expression one of genuine affection. Ethan studied the picture, wondering when exactly he had decided that success meant severing all connections to his past. When had he determined that vulnerability was weakness? When had numbers replaced people in the equation of his life? He tucked the photo into his wallet and began searching online for information about Margaret's medical symptoms. By midnight, he had compiled a list of possible conditions, potential treatments, and specialists in the Los Angeles area. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Sunday morning found him at his laptop researching something entirely different: restaurant, industry data for the Los Angeles market. When his executive assistant called, he surprised her by asking her to postpone Monday's investor meeting. Are you feeling well, Mr. Walker? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Actually, I've never felt better, he replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at Margaret and Emily's apartment with a small potted plant, an orchid that the florist had assured him was both elegant and difficult to kill. Emily greeted him with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Mr. Ethan, did you bring more ice cream? She asked hopefully. Not today, he smiled. But I did bring something for your grandmother. Margaret accepted the plant with gracious skepticism. You didn't need to do that. I wanted to, he replied simply. How are you feeling? Better, she said, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. Emily had already grabbed Ethan's hand. Can we go to the park? Please, Grandma. Mr. Ethan hasn't seen the ducks yet. Margaret hesitated, weighing her energy levels against her granddaughter's excitement. I'd be happy to take her, Ethan offered, if you trust me. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, a memory perhaps of a younger Ethan whom she had indeed trusted. The park at the end of the block, she conceded. 1 hour. Emily knows the rules. No talking to strangers, no going near the water without a grown-up, and always stay where you can see me, Emily recited dutifully. The park was modest but well-maintained, with a small pond where several ducks glided serenely across the water. Emily chattered nonstop, pointing out her favorite bench, the best climbing tree, and the spot where she'd once found a magic feather. Watching her feed the ducks with pieces of bread he'd purchased from a nearby vendor, Ethan felt a peculiar lightness. When was the last time he'd spent an hour doing something with no productive purpose? Something that wouldn't advance his career or increase his net worth. Did you live with Grandma when you were little? Emily asked suddenly. Not exactly, Ethan explained, choosing his words carefully. She worked at the place where I lived for a while, a place for children who didn't have parents to take care of them. Emily considered this. Like how I don't have a mommy or daddy now, just Grandma? Something like that. He nodded, surprised by her directness. What happened to your mommy and daddy? Ethan had rehearsed the answer to this question years ago, perfecting a concise response that satisfied curiosity without inviting pity. But looking at Emily's innocent face, the polished narrative felt wrong. My mother left when I was very small, he said honestly, and my father died when I was 6. That's how old I am, Emily exclaimed. 6 1/4. It was a difficult time, Ethan continued. But your grandmother made it better. She remembered everyone's birthday. She made special pancakes shaped like animals on Sundays. Emily's eyes widened. She makes elephant pancakes for me too, with banana slices for ears. The coincidence struck Ethan unexpectedly. Margaret had carried that tradition forward, from the children at St. Catherine's to her own granddaughter. As they walked back to the apartment, Emily's small hand trustingly in his, Ethan's mind worked on a problem. Not a business challenge, but a human one. How could he help Margaret and Emily without undermining the dignity Margaret so fiercely protected? The answer began to form as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. By the time they entered the apartment, where Margaret was preparing a simple dinner, Ethan had the outline of a plan. May I help? He asked, rolling up his sleeves without waiting for permission. Margaret raised an eyebrow but handed him a knife and a cutting board. Carrots, small pieces for the soup. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sounds, Emily's humming as she set the table and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. Your restaurant, Ethan said finally. The one that closed. What was it like? Margaret's hands slowed their work. La Maison Bleue, French-inspired but accessible. I was the head chef for almost 10 years. Was it successful? Before the corporate buyout? We had a loyal clientele, she said with quiet pride. Nothing fancy but good, honest food. People came back week after week. Ethan nodded, processing this information. There's a small commercial space for lease in the downtown arts district. It used to be a cafe, but the owner retired. The kitchen is already set up. Margaret gave him a sharp look. Why would that interest me? Because, Ethan said, choosing his words carefully, I've been thinking about diversifying my investments. Restaurant properties have good returns in the right location, but I don't know the first thing about running a restaurant. And I do, Margaret stated flatly. You do, he agreed. I provide the capital, you provide the expertise. A business partnership, not charity. Margaret set down her spoon, her expression unreadable. A partnership implies equal risk and equal reward. You'd be putting in sweat equity, Ethan countered. Your knowledge, your recipes, your management. I'd put in the financial investment. We split the profits. I'm 63, Ethan. Starting a restaurant is a young person's game. Age brings experience. Authenticity. 2 qualities lacking in most new LA restaurants. Margaret shook her head, but Ethan could see she was considering it. And Emily? I can't work restaurant hours with a 6-year-old. We could create a space for her at the restaurant after school, Ethan suggested, and arrange the schedule around her needs. That's the advantage of being the owner rather than an employee. Emily, who had been pretending not to listen, could contain herself no longer. Our own restaurant? Really? Can I help? Too? Please, Grandma. Margaret shot Ethan a look that clearly said, "Now look what you've done." It's just an idea, he said mildly. Think about it. Later, as Ethan prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door, leaving Emily absorbed in a drawing of what appeared to be a very large restaurant with a rainbow over it. Why are you doing this? Margaret asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. Is it guilt? Nostalgia? Ethan considered the question carefully. When you disappeared from St. Catherine's, I felt abandoned. Again. I promised myself I'd never depend on anyone else for anything. And how has that worked out for you? He smiled ruefully. I built a billion-dollar company. I have everything I thought I wanted. But yesterday Emily showed me a rock collection, and I felt more genuinely happy than I have in years. He paused. I'm not doing this for you, Margaret. I think I'm doing it for me. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll think about your proposal. No promises. That's all I ask, Ethan replied, knowing that in the business world, I'll think about it was often the first step toward yes. The Walker Enterprises Tower dominated the Los Angeles skyline, a gleaming monument to success and innovation. But as Ethan drove away from Margaret and Emily's apartment, the building seemed to mock him from a distance. 27 floors of glass and steel that had consumed his life for the past decade, yet suddenly felt hollow. His penthouse was exactly as he'd left it that morning, immaculate, designer-furnished, and utterly lifeless. No drawings on the refrigerator, no well-worn furniture bearing the imprints of those who loved it. No small voice asking impossible questions. Ethan loosened his tie and poured himself a scotch he didn't really want. His phone had accumulated 43 notifications during his absence from the digital world. None seemed important now. Instead of addressing them, he found himself kneeling before a storage closet, pulling out boxes he hadn't opened since moving in 3 years ago. In the third box, beneath college textbooks and business awards, he found what he was looking for. A small, battered tin box. Inside were the few mementos he'd kept from his childhood. A marble. A ticket stub from his first baseball game with his foster family. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a photograph. It showed a Christmas celebration at St. Catherine's. Younger versions of children whose names he'd mostly forgotten stood around a modestly decorated tree. In the background, partially cropped, stood Margaret. She wasn't looking at the camera but at the children, her expression one of genuine affection. Ethan studied the picture, wondering when exactly he had decided that success meant severing all connections to his past. When had he determined that vulnerability was weakness? When had numbers replaced people in the equation of his life? He tucked the photo into his wallet and began searching online for information about Margaret's medical symptoms. By midnight, he had compiled a list of possible conditions, potential treatments, and specialists in the Los Angeles area. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Sunday morning found him at his laptop, researching something entirely different: restaurant, industry data for the Los Angeles market. When his executive assistant called, he surprised her by asking her to postpone Monday's investor meeting. Are you feeling well, Mr. Walker? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Actually, I've never felt better, he replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at Margaret and Emily's apartment with a small potted plant, an orchid that the florist had assured him was both elegant and difficult to kill. Emily greeted him with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Mr. Ethan, did you bring more ice cream? She asked hopefully. Not today. He smiled. But I did bring something for your grandmother. Margaret accepted the plant with gracious skepticism. You didn't need to do that. I wanted to, he replied simply. How are you feeling? Better, she said, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. Emily had already grabbed Ethan's hand. Can we go to the park? Please, Grandma? Mr. Ethan hasn't seen the ducks yet. Margaret hesitated, weighing her energy levels against her granddaughter's excitement. I'd be happy to take her, Ethan offered. If you trust me? Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, a memory perhaps of a younger Ethan whom she had indeed trusted. The park at the end of the block, she conceded. 1 hour. Emily knows the rules. No talking to strangers, no going near the water without a grown-up, and always stay where you can see me. Emily recited dutifully. The park was modest but well-maintained, with a small pond where several ducks glided serenely across the water. Emily chattered nonstop, pointing out her favorite bench, the best climbing tree, and the spot where she'd once found a magic feather. Watching her feed the ducks with pieces of bread he'd purchased from a nearby vendor, Ethan felt a peculiar lightness. When was the last time he'd spent an hour doing something with no productive purpose? Something that wouldn't advance his career or increase his net worth. Did you live with Grandma when you were little? Emily asked suddenly. Not exactly, Ethan explained, choosing his words carefully. She worked at the place where I lived for a while. A place for children who didn't have parents to take care of them. Emily considered this. Like how I don't have a mommy or daddy now, just Grandma? Something like that. He nodded, surprised by her directness. What happened to your mommy and daddy? Ethan had rehearsed the answer to this question years ago, perfecting a concise response that satisfied curiosity without inviting pity, but looking at Emily's innocent face, the polished narrative felt wrong. My mother left when I was very small, he said honestly, and my father died when I was 6. That's how old I am, Emily exclaimed. 6 1/4. It was a difficult time, Ethan continued, but your grandmother made it better. She remembered everyone's birthday. She made special pancakes shaped like animals on Sundays. Emily's eyes widened. She makes elephant pancakes for me too, with banana slices for ears. The coincidence struck Ethan unexpectedly. Margaret had carried that tradition forward from the children at St. Catherine's to her own granddaughter. As they walked back to the apartment, Emily's small hand trustingly in his, Ethan's mind worked on a problem, not a business challenge, but a human one. How could he help Margaret and Emily without undermining the dignity Margaret so fiercely protected? The answer began to form as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. By the time they entered the apartment, where Margaret was preparing a simple dinner, Ethan had the outline of a plan. May I help? He asked, rolling up his sleeves without waiting for permission. Margaret raised an eyebrow but handed him a knife and a cutting board. Carrots, small pieces for the soup. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds Emily's humming as she set the table and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. Your restaurant, Ethan said finally. The one that closed. What was it like? Margaret's hands slowed their work. La Maison Bleue, French-inspired but accessible. I was the head chef for almost 10 years. Was it successful? Before the corporate buyout? We had a loyal clientele, she said with quiet pride. Nothing fancy, but good, honest food. People came back week after week. Ethan nodded, processing this information. There's a small commercial space for lease in the downtown arts district. It used to be a cafe, but the owner retired. The kitchen is already set up. Margaret gave him a sharp look. Why would that interest me? Because, Ethan said, choosing his words carefully, I've been thinking about diversifying my investments. Restaurant properties have good returns in the right location. But I don't know the first thing about running a restaurant. And I do, Margaret stated flatly. You do, he agreed. I provide the capital, you provide the expertise. A business, partnership, not charity. Margaret set down her spoon, her expression unreadable. A partnership implies equal risk and equal reward. You'd be putting in sweat equity, Ethan countered. Your knowledge, your recipes, your management. I'd put in the financial investment. We split the profits. I'm 63, Ethan. Starting a restaurant is a young person's game. Age brings experience, authenticity, two qualities lacking in most new LA restaurants. Margaret shook her head, but Ethan could see she was considering it. And Emily? I can't work restaurant hours with a 6-year-old. We could create a space for her at the restaurant after school, Ethan suggested, and arrange the schedule around her needs. That's the advantage of being the owner rather than an employee. Emily, who had been pretending not to listen, could contain herself no longer. Our own restaurant? Really? Can I help too? Please, Grandma. Margaret shot Ethan a look that clearly said, "Now look what you've done." "It's just an idea," he said, mildly. "Think about it." Later, as Ethan prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door, leaving Emily absorbed in a drawing of what appeared to be a very large restaurant with a rainbow over it. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. Is it guilt? Nostalgia? Ethan considered the question carefully. "When you disappeared from St. Catherine's, I felt abandoned. Again. I promised myself I'd never depend on anyone else for anything. And how has that worked out for you?" He smiled ruefully. "I built a billion-dollar company. I have everything I thought I wanted. But yesterday Emily showed me a rock collection and I felt more genuinely happy than I have in years." He paused. "I'm not doing this for you, Margaret. I think I'm doing it for me." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll think about your proposal. No promises." "That's all I ask," Ethan replied, knowing that in the business world, "I'll think about it" was often the first step toward yes. A week passed before Margaret called. Ethan had left his card, his personal number written on the back, not the corporate contact his assistant typically managed. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Margaret said without preamble when he answered. "And?" Ethan held his breath, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. "I'd like to see the space." The following afternoon, Ethan met Margaret and Emily outside a storefront on Artisan Row, a revitalized street in the downtown arts district. The location had previously housed a cafe called Rosemary's that had closed when its owner retired. Its large windows faced east, catching the morning sun, while a small courtyard in back offered potential for outdoor seating. "It's smaller than La Maison Bleue," Margaret observed as Ethan unlocked the door. "More manageable," he countered. "Lower overhead, less staff needed." Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through windows that needed cleaning. The dining area would seat about 40 guests, while the kitchen, though compact, featured commercial-grade appliances that had been left behind by the previous owner. Emily immediately claimed a corner table. "This is where I'll do my homework," she announced. "And here," she pointed to a small alcove, "we can put my books and crayons." Margaret moved slowly through the space, her experienced eye taking in details Ethan would never have noticed. The flow from kitchen to dining room, the positioning of the prep stations, the ventilation system. "The hood needs cleaning," she said, running a finger along the stainless steel. "And that refrigerator sounds like it's on its last legs." "All fixable," Ethan replied. Margaret continued her inspection, opening cabinets, testing the stove burners, checking the water pressure in the sinks. Emily followed her, absorbing her grandmother's commentary with solemn attention. "What would you serve here?" Ethan asked, watching as Margaret made mental calculations of kitchen capacity. She considered the question. Not French like before, something more personal, comfort food but elevated, dishes that make people feel at home. "Like your Sunday, pancakes?" A small smile crossed Margaret's face. "Perhaps as a brunch special." They spent nearly an hour in the empty restaurant, with Margaret noting necessary repairs and improvements. Emily had already begun decorating in her imagination, describing colorful curtains and flowers on every table. "We'd need to replace the flooring," Margaret said, pointing to worn tiles. "And repaint everything." Ethan made notes on his phone. "What else?" "The menu would be seasonal, rotating specials. We'd need to source from local suppliers for the best ingredients." Ethan nodded. recognizing that she was already thinking like an owner. When they finally stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to soften. Emily skipped ahead to examine a flower box outside the neighboring bookstore. "So?" Ethan asked. Margaret took a deep breath. "It has potential. Is that a yes?" "It's a I need to see the business proposal," she replied firmly. "On paper, with numbers." Ethan smiled. "I'll have it to you tomorrow." "And if we do this," Margaret continued, "it needs to be legitimate, a proper partnership agreement. I won't be a figurehead for your charity project." "I wouldn't want you to be," he assured her. "This would be your restaurant, Margaret, your vision." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. "There's one more condition." Her expression grew serious. "I need health insurance. Good coverage, not just the bare minimum." The request confirmed Ethan's suspicion that her health concerns were more serious than she'd admitted. "That won't be a problem." Emily returned, clutching a dandelion she'd found growing through a crack in the sidewalk. "Are we going to have the restaurant, Grandma?" The hope in her voice was unmistakable. Margaret exchanged a look with Ethan. "We're considering it, sweetheart." "Yay." Emily performed a small dance of celebration. "Can we call it Margaret and Emily's?" "We'll see," her grandmother replied, but Ethan noticed she didn't dismiss the idea outright. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Emily slipped her hand into Ethan's as naturally as if she'd been doing it for years. With her other hand holding Margaret's, they formed an unexpected chain that felt somehow right. "You know," Ethan said casually, "if we do this, I'll need your help with one more thing, Emily." "What?" she asked eagerly. "I've forgotten how to have fun. Do you think you could teach me?" Emily's resulting laughter echoed down the street, bright and clear in the afternoon sunshine. A sound, Ethan realized, that had been missing from his meticulously ordered world for far too long. 3. Weeks later, the transformation of the old cafe was well underway. The floors had been replaced, walls freshly painted in warm cream with dark blue accents. Colors Margaret had selected after considerable deliberation. Ethan found himself spending mornings at Walker Enterprises and afternoons at the restaurant site, often rolling up his sleeves to work alongside the contractors. Today he was helping install pendant lights over what would become the dining area. A little to the left, Margaret directed from below, her critical eye ensuring perfect placement. Since agreeing to the partnership, she had embraced the project with unexpected vigor. Her cough had improved following a visit to a pulmonologist, one of Ethan's non-negotiable conditions before signing their formal agreement. "Is this the light for table 6? Emily asked seriously, consulting the notebook where she recorded important restaurant business. Kindergarten was out for summer, and she'd appointed herself official project assistant. "That's right," Ethan confirmed, adjusting the fixture. "The one with the blue rim?" The door chimed as a delivery arrived. Sample plates and bowls Margaret had ordered to test for durability and aesthetics. Emily rushed to inspect them, carefully unpacking each piece as if it were treasure. "Your executives keep calling," Margaret noted, glancing at Ethan's phone which buzzed with yet another message. "Don't you need to get back?" Ethan shrugged. "They can handle things, I've delegated." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "The Ethan I remember never delegated anything. Even as a 9-year-old, you insisted on tying your own shoes when they kept coming undone." "People change," he replied, though the observation made him smile. "Some things stay the same, though," Margaret mused. "You still frown when you're concentrating, and you still try to solve everyone's problems." Before Ethan could respond, Emily called them over. She'd arranged the sample dishes on a makeshift table, complete with paper napkins and plastic utensils. "Time for a pretend dinner," she announced. "Grandma's making her famous invisible soup, and I'm the waitress." Margaret and Ethan exchanged amused glances before dutifully taking their seats at the table. "What's the soup of the day?" Ethan asked with exaggerated seriousness. Emily thought for a moment. "Happiness soup, with extra sprinkles of kindness." "Sounds delicious," he replied. "I'll have a large bowl." As they played along with Emily's restaurant game, Ethan realized something unexpected. The dusty, half-renovated space already felt more like home than his immaculate penthouse ever had. The opening day of Margaret and Emily's home kitchen arrived under clear September skies. The modest restaurant gleamed with fresh paint and polished fixtures. The menu, printed just yesterday, featured comfort foods elevated by Margaret's professional touch. Chicken pot pie with black truffle, macaroni and cheese with 3 artisanal cheeses, and of course, Sunday brunch pancakes shaped like elephants. In the kitchen, Margaret adjusted her chef's coat, a crisp white one that Ethan had insisted on having custom made with her name embroidered in blue. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the prep list one final time. "What if no one comes?" she whispered, a rare moment of vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. Ethan, dressed more casually than he'd been in public in years, khakis, and a button-down rather than his usual suit, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "They'll come," he assured her, "and they'll return because the food is exceptional." Emily burst into the kitchen resplendent in her custom-made junior chef apron, complete with her name and the restaurant logo, an elephant holding a spatula, designed from one of her drawings. "Grandma, Mr. Ethan, the chairs are all perfect. And I put a flower on every table." Her excitement was contagious, impossible to resist. "Everything looks beautiful, sweetheart." Margaret smiled, some of her tension visibly easing. "And the special table is ready too," Emily added importantly, "with the big chair and the children's books." The special table had been Emily's insistence, a corner spot with a small bookshelf for young diners who might get restless. It was one of many touches that made the restaurant uniquely theirs. At precisely 11 a.m., Ethan unlocked the front door. They decided on a soft opening, lunch service only for the first week, no advertising beyond some posts in local food groups and flyers at nearby businesses. For 15 excruciating minutes, the restaurant remained empty. Margaret paced the kitchen. Emily stationed herself hopefully by the door. Ethan checked the reservation system repeatedly, though they'd expected mostly walk-ins. When the bell above the door finally chimed, announcing their first customers, an elderly couple who'd read about the opening on a community bulletin board, Emily's delighted greeting could have powered the entire block. By noon, half the tables were filled. By 1 o'clock, there was a short waiting list. Word of mouth spread quickly. A new restaurant with food that tasted like childhood memories, even if you'd never had that particular dish before. In the kitchen, Margaret moved with renewed confidence, directing her small staff, a sous chef and a prep cook, with the authority of someone born to the role. When she stepped into the dining room to greet guests, her smile was genuine, her shoulders straight. Ethan, handling host duties for the day, caught her eye across the room. Neither spoke, but the shared look contained everything: relief, pride, and a growing sense that this unlikely partnership might be the most rewarding venture either had undertaken. A month after opening, Margaret and Emily's home kitchen had established itself as a neighborhood favorite. Weekday lunches were consistently busy, weekend brunches required reservations, and they'd gradually expanded to dinner service 3 nights a week. Most remarkably, the restaurant had attracted a genuinely diverse clientele. Tables were filled with everyone from hipsters seeking authentic dining experiences to families drawn by the child-friendly atmosphere, from business people who appreciated the high-quality food served efficiently to elderly residents who found the comfort foods reminiscent of their own pasts. Ethan had settled into an unexpected dual life. Mornings at Walker Enterprises, where he delegated more day-to-day operations to his executive team. Afternoons and evenings often at the restaurant, where he discovered a talent for the business side of food service, negotiating with suppliers, optimizing the reservation system, managing the books. Tonight, he sat at the small desk in what had become the restaurant's office, formerly a storage closet now transformed with efficient shelving and a narrow work table. The dinner service was winding down, and Margaret's voice occasionally drifted in from the kitchen as she guided her small staff through closing procedures. A soft knock interrupted his spreadsheet review. Emily stood in the doorway, already in her pajamas, her backpack over one shoulder. "Mr. Ethan, can you help me with my math homework? Grandma's finishing the kitchen." The restaurant's back room had been converted into a small apartment where Margaret and Emily now lived, more convenient than the third-floor walk-up, especially with Margaret's improved but still delicate health. Emily's new school was just 3 blocks away. Of course, Ethan closed his laptop. Let's see what we're working with. They settled at a corner table, the last customers having departed. Emily proudly showed him her worksheet of simple addition problems. I already did most of them, she explained. But these last ones are tricky. Ethan watched as she carefully counted on her fingers, her face screwed up in concentration. He resisted the urge to simply give her the answers, recognizing the importance of her working through the process. 9 plus 5, she mumbled. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Excellent, he praised as she wrote the number carefully. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, her chef's coat exchanged for a comfortable sweater. She smiled at the sight of them hunched over the worksheet. Looks like serious business, she commented, sliding into a chair beside them. Mr. Ethan is helping me with the hard ones, Emily explained. And I got them all right. Well done, Margaret said, pride evident in her voice. 5 more minutes, then bedtime. As Emily completed her final problem with a flourish, Ethan found himself studying Margaret. The past month had transformed her. The constant worry lines had softened. Her movements were more energetic, and her eyes held a spark that reminded him of the Margaret from his childhood. The new dessert was a hit, he told her as Emily packed up her schoolwork. We sold out by 8 o'clock. I'll increase the preparation amount tomorrow, Margaret nodded, though we should be careful not to alter the menu too frequently. Regulars like consistency. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's wide yawn. That's definitely bedtime, Margaret declared. Say goodnight to Mr. Ethan. Emily gave him a quick, fierce hug that had become their nightly ritual. Good night, Mr. Ethan. Will you be here for breakfast? The question held weight beyond its simplicity. Ethan had started joining them occasionally for breakfast before school and work. Not tomorrow, he replied, feeling an odd disappointment. I have an early meeting, but I'll be here for dinner service. As Margaret led a sleepy Emily toward their apartment, Ethan returned to the office to finish the accounts. The restaurant wasn't yet breaking even, but it was on track, performing better than most new establishments at the 1-month mark. Financial success, however, wasn't how Ethan measured this particular investment. By metrics that had never appeared on any Walker Enterprises spreadsheet, joy, purpose, connection, Margaret and Emily's was already showing extraordinary returns. Parent-teacher conference day, read the notice Emily proudly presented to Margaret over breakfast. My teacher says all families must attend. Margaret glanced at the paper, noting the date, just 2 days away, during the restaurant's busy lunch service. I'll make arrangements, she promised, though concern flickered across her face. Later that morning, as Margaret prepared for the day's service, she mentioned the conference to Ethan, who had stopped by with a new point-of-sale system he'd been researching. I'll need to adjust the schedule, she said, efficiently chopping herbs. Perhaps Lisa can cover the kitchen for an hour. Or I could go, Ethan offered without thinking. The words surprised him as much as Margaret, whose knife paused mid-chop. You? If that would help, he said, suddenly uncertain. Though I'm not. No, it would be wonderful, Margaret interrupted. Emily would be thrilled. She talks about you constantly at school. Her teacher probably thinks you're. She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. Ethan had become a fixture in Emily's life, attending her school play, helping with homework, teaching her to use the calculator app on his phone. I'd be happy to, he confirmed, ignoring the strange flutter in his chest. Just send me the details. 2 days later, Ethan found himself sitting in a child-sized chair in Emily's brightly decorated classroom. The teacher, Ms. Winters, greeted him with a warm smile. Mr. Walker, I'm so glad to meet you. Emily talks about you all the time. All good things, I hope, he replied, feeling strangely nervous. Absolutely. She's quite proud of the restaurant. Her family runs. Family. The word resonated unexpectedly. Ethan didn't correct her assumption. Ms. Winters reviewed Emily's progress. Excellent in reading and art, improving in math, still working on raising her hand before speaking. She showed Ethan a family portrait Emily had drawn. 3 figures, labeled Grandma, me, and Mr. Ethan, standing in front of a building with our restaurant written above it. Emily has made remarkable progress socially, Ms. Winters noted. Earlier this year she was quite reserved. Now she's confident, engaged. The stability has clearly been beneficial. Stability, another concept Ethan had rarely associated with himself. We're very proud of her, he heard himself saying. When the conference ended, Ethan found Emily waiting outside with a classroom aide, practically bouncing with excitement. Did Ms. Winters say I'm smart? She demanded immediately. Very smart, he confirmed. And creative. She showed me your drawing. Emily beamed, slipping her hand into his with familiar ease as they walked toward the car. Are we going to the restaurant now? Can I tell Grandma about my good report? Absolutely, Ethan agreed. I think this calls for a celebration dessert. As they drove, Emily chattered about her friends and projects, while Ethan found himself contemplating Ms. Winters' assumptions. He wasn't Emily's father, wasn't even technically family, yet somehow imperceptibly he'd begun filling a family-shaped role in her life. The realization should have triggered alarm, commitment, emotional entanglement, vulnerability. Instead, it felt remarkably right. At a stoplight, Emily suddenly asked, Mr. Ethan, do you live all alone in your big apartment? I do, he replied, startled by the question. She considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. Doesn't that get lonely? Sometimes, he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. You could live closer to us, she suggested with a child's straightforward logic. Then you wouldn't have to drive so far every day. As they pulled up to the restaurant, Ethan found himself without a ready answer. 6 months ago, his modernist penthouse had seemed the perfect reflection of his success. Now measured against the warmth of Margaret's kitchen and Emily's innocent questions, it felt like an empty showcase rather than a home. Margaret greeted them at the service entrance, wiping her hands on her apron. How did it go? Mr. Ethan sat in the tiny chairs, Emily reported immediately, and Ms. Winters said I'm very smart. Margaret's eyes met Ethan's over Emily's head, silently asking for details. Flying colors, he confirmed with a smile. Though we should probably work on the hand-raising. We? Margaret repeated softly, a curious expression crossing her face. Yes, I suppose we should. The November evening brought an early chill to Los Angeles. The restaurant had closed for the night, and Ethan was finalizing next week's supply orders when his phone buzzed with a corporate emergency. A server had crashed, taking down the Walker Enterprises customer database. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt annoyed rather than energized by a crisis. He made the necessary calls, set his technical team in motion, then reluctantly told Margaret he needed to handle the situation personally. Of course, she nodded, understanding the responsibility he carried. We'll see you tomorrow. It took 17 hours to resolve the issue, requiring Ethan to work through the night and into the following day. By the time the system was restored, he had missed lunch service at the restaurant, the first time he'd been absent since opening day. Exhausted, he drove to Margaret and Emily's, rather than his penthouse, needing to see the place even if service was ending. The restaurant had become his touchstone, a reality check against the digital abstraction of his corporate world. He found Margaret sitting alone at a back table, staring at an envelope. Her expression stopped him cold. What's happened? He asked, all fatigue forgotten. Margaret looked up, momentarily startled from her thoughts. Carmen, she whispered. She's back. Carmen. Emily's mother. My daughter. Margaret's hands trembled as she held out the envelope. She left this with one of the servers today. Ethan took the envelope gingerly. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph of a younger woman with Emily's eyes and Margaret's determined jawline. The letter was straightforward but emotional. Carmen explained that she had left Emily because she was fleeing an abusive relationship. Her ex-partner had threatened to harm Emily to control her, so she'd made the heartbreaking choice to disappear, believing distance would keep her daughter safe. Now, with the man imprisoned for unrelated charges, she felt it was finally safe to return. "She's been watching us," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "She saw the restaurant, saw Emily, saw you. She thinks." Margaret couldn't finish, but Ethan understood. Carmen had observed him with Emily and drawn conclusions about his role in their lives. "What are you going to do?" he asked gently. "What can I do?" Margaret's voice broke. "She's Emily's mother. She has rights. Does the letter say what she wants? To meet, to explain in person, to reconnect with Emily." Ethan sat beside her, processing the implications. "And you? What do you want?" "I want Emily to be happy," Margaret said immediately. "I want." She paused, gathering strength. "I want my daughter back. I never stopped loving her, even when I was so angry at her choices. But I'm terrified, Ethan. What if she takes Emily away? What if she disappears again?" The vulnerability in Margaret's voice struck Ethan deeply. This woman who had weathered so much, who had rebuilt her life from nothing, was facing her deepest fear. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "Together." "We?" Margaret looked at him, questions in her eyes. "Yes, we." Ethan took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of cooking, the strength beneath the trembling. "You're not alone in this, Margaret. But Carmen is Emily's mother and I'm someone who cares deeply about both of you," he interrupted. "Someone who isn't going anywhere." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "What will we tell Emily? She barely remembers Carmen." "The truth," Ethan said simply. "As gently as we can. And then we'll take it one step at a time." As they sat in the quiet restaurant, hands clasped across the table, Ethan realized the corporate crisis that had seemed so urgent mere hours ago had faded to insignificance. This fragile, complicated human connection was what truly mattered. The choice to include himself in Margaret's "we" hadn't been calculated or considered. It had been instinctive, honest. Somewhere along the line, without formal agreement or declaration, they had indeed become a "we," a unit, a family of sorts. And families, Ethan was learning, stood together in crises. "Tomorrow," Margaret decided finally. "We'll tell her tomorrow. Will you be here?" "I'll be here," Ethan promised. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." They told Emily over breakfast the next morning in the quiet restaurant before staff arrived. Margaret had barely slept, rehearsing what to say, while Ethan had arrived early, with a small stuffed elephant, comfort for whatever emotions might arise. "Emily, sweetheart," Margaret began carefully. "Do you remember when we've talked about your mother? About Carmen?" Emily nodded, spooning cereal into her mouth. "She had to go away when I was little." "That's right." Margaret glanced at Ethan, drawing strength from his presence. "Well, something wonderful and surprising has happened. Your mother has come back. She wants to see you." Emily's spoon froze midway to her mouth. "My mother? Like, my real mother?" "Yes, your birth mother," Margaret confirmed. "My daughter." Emily set down her spoon, her face scrunched in concentration. "Is she going to take me away?" The directness of the question caught both adults off guard. Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's small hands in hers. "No, sweetheart, you will always live with me. But your mother wants to be part of your life again, if that's okay with you." Emily considered this with remarkable seriousness for a 6-year-old. "Does she know about the restaurant? And Mr. Ethan?" "She knows about the restaurant," Ethan answered, gently. "And she's seen me with you and your grandmother." "When will I see her?" Emily asked, her voice smaller now. "Today, if you'd like," Margaret said. "After school, she'll come here to the restaurant so you'll be somewhere familiar." Emily nodded slowly, then looked directly at Ethan. "Will you be here too?" Something tightened in Ethan's chest at the trust implied in that question. "If you want me to be." I do, Emily said with the absolute certainty children sometimes possess. Then, with the remarkable adaptability of young minds, she returned to her cereal. Can I wear my blue dress? The one with butterflies? Of course, Margaret agreed, relief evident in her voice. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, who reached under the table to squeeze her hand reassuringly. The morning proceeded with nervous anticipation. Margaret alternated between periods of intense kitchen focus and moments of distraction. Ethan handled the business tasks mechanically, his mind on the afternoon meeting. At 3:30, Emily returned from school, bouncing with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty in her butterfly dress. At 4:00, as arranged, a young woman with Emily's eyes and Margaret's determined jawline entered the restaurant. Carmen Phillips stood hesitantly by the door, clutching a small wrapped package, her gaze moving anxiously from Margaret to Ethan to Emily. The little girl stared back with open curiosity, from the safety of Margaret's side. "Hello, Emily," Carmen said softly. "I've missed you very much." The reunion had begun. The integration of Carmen into their lives proceeded cautiously. After the initial meeting, awkward but ultimately hopeful, a routine began to form. Carmen would visit Emily at the restaurant 3 afternoons a week, their time together carefully structured to build comfort and trust. Margaret watched these interactions with a mixture of hope and apprehension, her joy at having her daughter, back tempered by fear of losing Emily. Carmen seemed changed, more mature, less impulsive than the young woman who had disappeared 3 years ago. But trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly. Ethan found himself in the unexpected role of facilitator. His natural talent for negotiation and problem-solving created a bridge between Margaret's protective caution and Carmen's eager desire to reconnect with her daughter. "She's good with Emily," Ethan observed one evening as he and Margaret watched. Through the kitchen pass-through, Carmen was teaching Emily to make origami swans at one of the back tables, their heads bent together in concentration. "She always was," Margaret admitted. Even as a teenager, Carmen had a way with children. It was adults she struggled with. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, Carmen approached Ethan while Margaret was busy in the kitchen. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything you've done for my mother and Emily." Ethan shook his head. "They've done as much for me." Carmen studied him curiously. "Mom says you were once one of her kids at St. Catherine's. That's quite the full-circle moment." "Life has strange symmetry sometimes," Ethan agreed. Carmen hesitated, then pressed on. "And what exactly is your relationship with my family now? Emily talks about you constantly and Mom clearly relies on you, but..." The question, though expected, still caught Ethan off guard. What was his relationship with them? Business partner? Friend? Something more undefined but equally meaningful? "I care about them," he said finally. "Very much." Carmen nodded, seemingly satisfied with the simple honesty of his answer. As Christmas approached, a new challenge emerged. Carmen, now settled in a small apartment 10 blocks from the restaurant, wanted Emily to spend Christmas Eve with her. Margaret, for whom the holiday had always been a treasured time with her granddaughter, was devastated at the prospect. "It's just one evening," Carmen argued. "You'll have her Christmas morning." "It's our tradition," Margaret countered. "We always bake cookies for Santa on Christmas Eve." Emily, caught between the adults she loved, grew increasingly anxious about the conflict. It was Ethan who finally proposed a solution. "What if we all spend Christmas Eve together?" he suggested. "At the restaurant. We could close early, have a private celebration. Emily would have everyone she cares about in one place." The idea, though initially met with uncertainty, eventually took hold. Plans expanded. The staff would join with their families for a pre-Christmas dinner, creating a community celebration rather than a potentially tense family gathering. On December 23rd, as they decorated the restaurant with garlands and lights, Ethan realized that this would be his first Christmas in 20 years not spent alone in his apartment, reviewing year-end reports. The thought filled him with unexpected warmth. One more way his life had been transformed by a chance encounter with a hungry child and her whispered concern for her grandmother. Christmas Eve transformed Margaret and Emily's into a wonderland of twinkling lights, evergreen boughs, and delectable aromas. Margaret had outdone herself with the menu. Traditional holiday dishes elevated by her expert touch, with special attention to Emily's favorites. Staff members and their families arrived first, filling the restaurant with cheerful conversation. Lisa, the sous chef, brought her teenage sons who immediately took to teaching Emily card tricks. Marco, their most reliable server, introduced his husband and their new baby, whom Emily regarded with fascinated reverence. Carmen arrived bearing carefully wrapped presents, her nervousness evident in her too bright smile. She'd made impressive strides in the past month, finding work as a graphic designer at a small firm, attending therapy regularly, and building a consistent presence in Emily's life. "The place looks magical," she told Margaret, genuine admiration. In her voice, Margaret, who had been tense about the evening, softened at the compliment. "Thank you for the garlands. They're perfect for the windows." Carmen had contributed her artistic talent to the decorations, creating paper garlands that caught the light beautifully. It was a small thing, but significant. Her first real contribution to the restaurant that had become the heart of their family. Ethan arrived last, having stopped at his penthouse to change and collect gifts. He paused in the doorway, struck by the scene before him. The restaurant vibrant with life and laughter, so different from the corporate holiday parties he typically attended. Emily spotted him immediately. "Mr. Ethan, you're here." She ran to him, her red velvet dress swirling. "Now everyone's here and Christmas can really start." Dinner was served family style, with dishes passed around communal tables pushed together down the center of the restaurant. Margaret, finally relaxing, shared stories of Christmases past, including ones from St. Catherine's that made Ethan smile with recognition. After the meal, Emily insisted everyone gather for a special announcement. Standing on a chair, looking solemnly important, she declared, "This is the best Christmas ever because all my family is here together." Her simple statement silenced the room, its profound truth resonating with everyone present. Later, as staff began departing with leftovers and warm wishes, Ethan found himself near the small Christmas tree with Margaret and Carmen. Emily had fallen asleep on a banquette, exhausted from excitement. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly to Ethan. "This was your vision, bringing everyone together." Carmen nodded agreement. It could have been awkward and tense. Instead, it was healing. Ethan shook his head. "I just made a suggestion. You two did the hard work, finding a way forward for Emily's sake. For all our sakes," Carmen corrected gently. As they stood in the glow of Christmas lights, watching over the sleeping child who had unwittingly brought them together, Ethan recognized that he had received the greatest gift of all, belonging to something larger than himself, a circle of connection he'd once believed forever beyond his reach. Spring arrived in Los Angeles with a burst of wildflowers and warm breezes. Margaret and Emily's home kitchen celebrated its 6-month anniversary with a special menu and a write-up in the local food section that praised its authentic warmth and genuinely familial atmosphere. On a Sunday morning in April, Ethan parked his car not at the restaurant but in front of a real estate office. After confirming his appointment, he followed the agent to a historic brownstone just 4 blocks from Margaret and Emily's. "The previous owner maintained it beautifully," the agent explained, unlocking the door. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, and the kitchen was recently updated. Ethan walked through the rooms, picturing not sleek, modern furniture, but comfortable pieces where a 6-year-old could curl up with books. He imagined the smaller bedroom filled with Emily's art supplies, the guest room perfect for Carmen during holiday visits, the master bedroom a peaceful retreat for. He stopped, that thought reminding himself not to get ahead of reality. "I'll take it," he told the surprised agent, who hadn't even finished showing the property. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at the restaurant as usual for Sunday brunch. Margaret was teaching Emily to make her famous elephant pancakes, a process that involved more flour on their faces than in the batter. "Mr. Ethan," Emily called, waving a batter-covered spoon. "I'm making the pancakes myself today." I can see that, he laughed, noting the smears of batter across the kitchen counter. You're a natural chef. Margaret smiled at him over Emily's head, a soft expression that had become increasingly common between them. You're just in time. Emily insists you need to taste test her creation. I would be honored, Ethan replied with mock seriousness. As they sat together at the family table in the back, Emily proudly served misshapen but surprisingly tasty pancakes. Carmen joined them, bringing fresh strawberries from the farmer's market. The conversation flowed easily among them, plans for summer vacation mixing with ideas for seasonal menu changes. Watching them, Ethan felt a sense of completion, unlike anything his business successes had ever provided. 6 months ago, he'd stumbled into this makeshift family through a chance encounter with a hungry child. Now, he couldn't imagine life without them. When Emily dashed off to get her latest school art project, Ethan cleared his throat nervously. I've been thinking, he began, addressing both Margaret and Carmen. My penthouse is ridiculously far from here, and I spend most of my time at the restaurant anyway. Margaret watched him with curious eyes, while Carmen hid a knowing smile behind her coffee cup. I've purchased a house nearby, he continued. It's more space than I need, really. 3 bedrooms, a garden. He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Ethan? I'm asking if you might consider a new arrangement. All of us. A real home. Carmen discreetly excused herself as Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You know, Margaret said softly. For someone so successful in business, you're remarkably indirect about personal matters. Ethan laughed, a weight lifting from his chest. Is that a yes? It's a we should tell Emily together, Margaret replied, squeezing his hand. As Emily returned, sketchbook in hand, Ethan realized the most valuable investment he'd ever made wasn't in tech stocks or restaurant properties. It was in the simple, profound currency of love, a whispered concern for someone hungry and the courage to listen when it mattered most.